All right, Rabbi, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Yoel and Sarah Kalman in celebration of the completion of Seder Nezikin, and the Schus of Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Nathan Perry Smith and the Schus of the entire Kehillah, our week of learning sponsors. Alan and Sumairich, commemoration of the sites of their grandparents, aunts, and uncles. Avram ben Yaakov HaKohen, Basha Bas Chaim, Yitzchak ben Yaakov HaKohen, Fega Bas Avram HaKohen, Hirsch ben Avram HaKohen, Mordechai ben Avram HaKohen, Zichrono Livrach, and Richard and Judy Nudelman, Le'iloi Nishmas, Mr. Marvin Schwartz, Mechel, Nachman ben Nochum, Zichrono Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slavin Aliyah, families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Please Baruch Hu Shemir Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'Chol Maaseh Yedehem. As with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Tes Zayin 16. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Tes Amud Beis 15b. Says the Mishnah as follows: Kol Zevachim shekiblu daman. So we'll say we're dealing with the following situation: any carbon that where Kabbalah, remember again, Kabbalah is the act of receiving the blood. We have Shchita, which is slaughter, right? And then Kabbalah, which is, again, the first, Shchita is Ksher Bizar. Shchita can be done by anyone, but Kabbalah ultimately, again, requires a bona fide Kohen. So now the Mishnah says, if Kabbalah was done by any of the following individuals, it essentially invalidates the Avodah. Who's the list of invalid individuals? Number one, Zar, non-Kohen. Number two, Onein. Oni is a person in a state of Avelos, specifically in the state between death and burial. Tvul Yom. Tvul Yom is a person who went to the mikvah, but ultimately, again, requires Ha'erav Shemesh. Right? So remember again, sometimes you go to the mikvah, going to the mikvah is not enough, you also need sunset. That's called the Tvul Yom. B'chusar Kippurim. B'chusar Kippurim is a person who was Tameh, did all of the pieces for his Tara, but still has outstanding karbanos. A good example of this would be a Zav or a Mitzora. So these individuals, again, who need to go to the mikvah, need to wait a requisite amount of time, but also need karbanos. So they went to the mikvah, waited the requisite amount of time, went to the mikvah, but still have not brought their karbanos. That's Mechusar Kippurim. Mechusar Begadim is a Kohen who is not wearing all of the proper Kohanic vestments. Shelo Rachat Yadayim Raglayim, a Kohen who did not wash his hands and his feet. Arel, uncircumcised. Tameh, Yoshev, right? Yoshev is a Kohen who's sitting. We're going to see that Avodah has to be done in a standing position. Omeid al Gabe Kalim, a Kohen who's standing on top of utensils, which essentially we're going to see that Halacha L'Mais, in order for Avodah to be kosher, you have to be standing directly on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash. So Omeid al Gabe Kalim, al Gabe Behema, or on top of an animal, al Gabe Ragle Chavero, or standing on his friend's feet. Common denominator in all of those cases is that halacha l'maisa, you're not standing directly on the floor. In all of these cases, puzzle. Ultimately, the avodah is puzzle because either the individual is not in the right, either it's not the right individual, like a zar, or the Kohen himself is not in the right state. Kibel b'smol, puzzle. What happens if Kabbalah was done with the left hand? Right? He did Kabbalah. He received it with his left hand. Puzzle. Ultimately, again, this is puzzle. Reb Shimon says no. It's kosher. Good. So we'll say, see, it's already from this Mishnah. There's a lot of exciting Gemaras ahead of us over here because there's a lot of fascinating details in all of this. But again, focus on what invalidates Kabbalah. Says the Gemara. Now we're going to go through the list one by one. Zar. And how do we know that if a non-Kohen does Kabbalah, ultimately, again, it is possible? The Tani Levi, Daber el Aaron ve'el Bonav Lemar, the Nazru Mikadshe B'nei Yisrael. Now, I will say the truth is, lav dafka that the Gemara is just talking about Kabbalah. Just in general, what the Gemara is asking over here is, from where do we know that halacha l'maisa, a non-Kohen is not allowed to do avoda? So the pasuk says, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, V'yinazru Mikadshe B'nei Yisrael. Now, V'yinazru literally means they should remove themselves, just like a nazir is removed from wine and grapes. V'yinazru, they should remove themselves from Kadshe B'nei Yisrael. Now, the context over here, Rashi points out, is Tumah, and saying that really, again, Kohanim cannot operate in a state of Tumah. But this phrase, B'yinazru Mikadshe B'nei Yisrael, ultimately, again, seems to be prohibiting something else. Coming to us, who is supposed to stay away from the avodah? Who is that? If you want to say it's talking about women, carbon nashim b'tumah krav, would you have a havamina that the carbon of a woman could be offered up in tumah? Maybe he's coming to exclude idolaters. Hashtag tzitz lo. But again, I will say if the tzitz, now in general, we saw this back in our heart days a little bit, avodah zarah days a little bit, that the tzitz is meratza, that ultimately, again, remember, the tzitz refers to the plate that the Kohen Gadol wears on his forehead that says Kodesh LaHashem. That tzitz has Shavuos days. That tzitz has the ability to go ahead and I can pretty much say any Masechta, and you guys will just nod. Thank you for being so agreeable, right? So it was Yevamos Daf Beis, right? So the tzitz, remember, so the tzitz is the plate that the Kohen Gadol wears on his head that says Kodesh LaHashem. The act of just wearing that tzitz, by definition, atones for certain things, specifically for certain parts of sacrificial service which were done in a state of ritual impurity. So that only works, ultimately, again, for Jews. If an akum did something, ultimately, again, the tzitz doesn't affect atonement for that. Right? By ultimately, again, by something was done b'shogeg or b'mezid, the tzitz does not help. Therefore, b'tumah krav, would you have a havamina that ultimately, again, that the akum could offer up something in a state of tumah? Elahachi kamar, rather, here's what it's coming to exclude. Elahachi kamar, vayinaz mekadshe b'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu. Or really what it means is, or really the way to read it is, ultimately, again, those who are in a state of tumah ultimately have to be careful to stay away from anything sacrificial in nature. B'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu. Furthermore, again, B'nei Yisrael, i.e., non-Kohanim, cannot get involved in the avodah, for if they do, ultimately, again, they profane it. So Rabbi say, here is the proof that a zar is not permitted to get involved in any part of the sacrificial rites. Now, by the way, we know that shchita is kshera bizar, but as the Gemara introduced to yesterday or the day before, it's actually pretty dramatic that the Gemara understands that shchita is actually not an avodah, which sounds totally counterintuitive. But again, those two things have to be true. In order for a zar to do shchita can't be an avoda, because if shchita is an avoda, it must be done by a kohen. But again, I both say it's putting the comma in this statement. V'inazru mikadshe. Those who are tamei have to remain away, stay away from kadshim. B'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu. And B'nei Yisrael zarim, azar, non-kohanim, can't get involved with karbanos, otherwise they profane it. Good. So in the Rabbi Shmuel, they learned out this idea that a zar can't do the avodah. They learned it out from a kal v'chomer, from a Baal Mum. Baal Mum refers to a blemished Kohen. What's the kal v'chomer? Ma Baal Mum sha'ochel. A Baal Mum. Now, interestingly enough, a Baal Mum, while he's not permitted to do avodah, he's allowed to eat from karbanos. He's allowed to eat. So ma Baal Mum sha'ochel. So Baal Mum was allowed to eat karbanos. Im avad chilal. If he does the avodah, he profanes it. That's a pasuk. Right? If he does the avodah, he profanes it. Rashi says, so again, a Baal Mum who's allowed to eat karbanos, if he profanes the top of Tazayim, Zar, She'ina Ochel, Eino Din Shem Avad Chila, so a Zar, non-Kohen, who's not permitted to eat karbanos, right, in general. Again, Rashi points out, Kachek Kadoshim. Obviously, Kachim Kalim is like a Shlamim, so a Zar, non-Kohen, does get a portion of that. But in Kachek Kadoshim, ultimately, again, a zar does not eat. So if a zar is not allowed to eat, then of course it goes without saying that if what? That if he does the avodah, he's going to profane it. So Gemara says, 1 second, the comparison is not necessarily good. Mala b'amum shekin asa bo karav kimakriv. Ba'amum is different. Because what's unique about ba'amum? The invalidation of ba'amum applies to both the kohen and the karban. Interesting, right? If the Kohen has a mum, he can't go ahead and do the avodah. If the karban has a mum, ultimately it can't be offered. So perhaps it's a unique type of status. Tamei ochiach. Well, tamei will because we'll say what happens with tamei. Ultimately, again, by a tamei, a Kohen who's tamei is not allowed to do the avodah, and if he does so, he profanes it. But yet that designation does not apply to the animal itself. Ma'ala tamei shekin metamei. Tamei is different. Why? Because someone who's tamei has the ability to convey that state to someone else. Baal Mum Yochiach. So we come back to Baal Mum, and here's the problem. Chazra Din. So remember again, just to keep our eye on the ball. What are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out another source for the fact that a zar isn't allowed to do the avoda. So we already advanced to one answer. Now the Gemara, or should say, the Rabbi Shmuel is advancing the Kavachomer is ultimately into a Baal Mum. If a Baal Mum who's allowed to eat from karbanos is not allowed to do the avoda, and if he does so, the avoda is invalid, then all the more so a zar who is not permitted to eat from karbanos, specifically kachei kadoshim, if he does the avoda is invalid. That's the, and the Gemara says, v'chazra din lo rizeh kareizah, v'lo rizeh kareizah. Reality is, again, these things are not totally similar. So what is the common denominator? Shemusharin. Ultimately, again, they are prohibited from doing the avoda. And if they do the avoda, ultimately, again, they profane it, i.e., it's invalid. Af ani avizar shehu musar v'im avad chilal. So I could also include a zar in here. I could also include a non-Kohen, because he satisfies his common denominator as well. He is not allowed to do the avoda, as we discussed. And if he does so, ultimately, again, he invalidates the avoda. Incredible. Now, you second, minalan de mushar. But from where do that Kavachomer presupposes that a zar is not allowed to do the avoda? Where do you know that from? Where do you know that a zar is not allowed to do the avoda? So the Gemara says, I mi v'yinazru. So again, if you want to go back to what we just quoted before, v'yinazru b'nei Yisrael, v'yinazru mikachei b'nei Yisrael v'leichalalu. If that's the case, if that's the passage we just quoted before, if that's the case, b'gufei ksibei, then the Rebbe say you don't need this whole Kavachomer. Why not? Because then pretty much it's explicit in the pasuk that the zar is not allowed to do the avoda, and if he does so, he profanes it, i.e., invalidates it. So your whole Kavachomer is unnecessary. Mivizar lo yikrav aleichem. Rather, the Gemara says it must be learned out from the pasuk of vizar lo yikariv aleichem. So the zar literally again shall not come close to you. The Gemara says, okay. But still going back to the Kavachomer, we could ask, this is very interesting. Maybe the common denominator amongst the cases quoted before is that they are not permitted to go ahead and serve on a bama. Rashi said, if you look at Rashi, it's in the short lines, about 6 lines in. Bebamas Yochid. So we're talking over Rebbe's memory, and we referenced this yesterday as well. There's what's called the Bamas Yochid and the Bama Gedola. So Bama Gedola was a Bama, right, which was an altar that was used for communal sacrifice. This is talking about outside of the Mishkan, outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Bamas Yochid was a Bama you had in your backyard, your own private Bama. So Rashi points out over here, Bebamas Yochid, Bishas Hetra Bamas, this Nan Perak Basra, has Azman Va'anoser Va'atameh, Shavin Bazeh. Or Bryce Tanya Allah Dvarim Shishav Sab Bama Kitana Bama Gedola Dam Matim Mefago Umumin Tomar Bizar Shekasher Bebama. So also here's what's interesting. A zar, right? A zar ultimately again is permitted by a bama, right? A zar is permitted to offer up by a bama. Yet interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, these other individuals are not. So perhaps that's the distinction. To which the Gemara says, Lo tema tama yochiach. Because Tami can prove that. Ela ema onein yochiach. I can bring up onein. Ma la onein shekin aser b'maiser. Onein is different. Why? Because in onein, ultimately, it's prohibited to consume maiser. Ba'mum yochiach. And once again, the Gemara says, V'chazra adin lo rizeh karizeh, v'lo rizeh karizeh, hatzara shava shabahan shemus harin. So again, it supposed to become full circle. What's the common denominator? The common denominator ultimately, again, is that all of these individuals are precluded from doing the avoda. And if they do so, ultimately, again, the avoda is invalid. Therefore, I will come to include a zar who is not permitted to do the avoda, and if he does so, the avoda is invalid. So we'll say, so again, what the Gemara is doing is creating essentially like a paradigm or a principle. And the principle is, anytime someone is not permitted to do the avoda, if they do so, ultimately the avoda is invalidated. So too, I'll include zar in that same category as well. Hachanami. So the Gemara says, lifroch. But once again, why can't I go ahead and ultimately say that maybe the common denominator in all these cases, aside from zar, is that they're not permitted to offer up in a bama. Yet a zar is permitted to offer up by a bama. One second. How do I know that an onain is not permitted to offer up on a bama? Maybe an onain is permitted to offer up on a bama. From Misharshia Amar Asik Kavachomer Miyoshev. So Misharshia says, okay, so that rejected that limud. From Misharshia comes along and says, we could bring a Kavachomer from Yoshev. Now again, on both sides. So just understand, still same topic. The Gemara is still focused on how do I know that if a zar, right? The Mishnah told me that if a zar does the avoda, specifically Kabbalah, ultimately again the Kabbalah is invalid. So if we globalize this, if a zar does avoda, ultimately again the avoda is invalid. All we're asking now is how do we know that? So first approach was Gemara quoted a pasuk. Second approach to be Rabbi Shmuel, trying to learn how to Kavachomer. We're just trying to figure out what the Kavachomer is. So Misharshia Amar Ase Kavachomer Yoshev. From Misharshia, he brings a Kavachomer from Yoshev. What's the case of Yoshev? Yoshev is the case of a Kohen who is sitting during the avoda. Apparently, if you sit while doing the avoda, ultimately, again, the avoda is invalidated. So it says the Gemara, Ma Yoshev Sha'ochel, Ma Yoshev Sha'ochel, Ma Yoshev Sha'ochel, Im Avad Chilel. Now, again, I will say, remember again, Yoshev could eat. What does this mean? You're allowed to eat karbanos while sitting. Right? So in other words, even if a Kohen is sitting, he's allowed to eat karbanos. So again, yet, if he does the avoda while in a state of sitting, ultimately the avoda is invalidated. Zar she'ena ochel, a zar who's not allowed to eat kachei kadoshim, right? High sanctity karbanos under any circumstances, right? You just can't eat eno din shem avad chilal. Certainly, if he does the avoda is profaned. The avoda is invalid. So we'll say that's the kavachomer. That's kavachomer. If Yoshev, a Kohen who's sitting, could eat karbanos, but if he does the avoda while sitting, the avoda is invalidated, then certainly a zar who's not allowed to eat under any circumstances, if he does the avoda will be invalidated. Says the Gemara, one second. Mali Yoshev shekim pasol le'edos. Interesting. The Gemara says, well, you can't necessarily bring a raya from Yoshev. Why not? Because Yoshev sitting has its own set of strictures, even outside of avoda. Namely what? That ultimately, again, a witness who is sitting is not permitted to give eidos. We saw this in our Makkos days. Ultimately, again, that someone going ahead and giving eidos has to go ahead and say, Rashi says over Shekim, Pasal eidos, almost right across. In Rashi, Darminim Mesech Shavuos, Va'amdu Shnei Ha'anoshim, Ube'edim HaKosam Medaber. Gemara Mesech Shavuos says, Amdu Shnei Ha'anoshim. Pasuk says, the two people will stand. So you see from here that eidos has to be given in a standing way. So the Gemara says, Mali Yoshev Shekim Basal, Leidos Miyushav Talmid Chacham. No, that's not true because, for example, Talmid Chacham is allowed to sit. Rashi says over Meshani Miyushav Talmid Chacham, Hacham Ma'isila the Kashala Eidos Kidamin on Hasam Shebezdin Cholkim Lo Kavod Umoshiven also. Talmid Chacham is allowed to sit. So therefore, again, the point where the Gemara is saying is it's not true. It's not an exclusive rule that eidos has to be given sitting down. We see examples of where an eid is allowed to go ahead and sit, to which the Gemara says, Malashim Yoshev Shekim Pasal Eidos. The Talmid Chacham is an exception. In general, the general category of sitting is one ultimately, again, that is problematic by testimony. So therefore, again, the Gemara answers up, Shem Yoshev Lo Parach. Okay, so however, the Tana over here is not going to destroy the Kavachomer based on a category of yeshiva. Vim Tim Salomar Parach. And if ultimately, again, you want to say he would ask it based on the fact that perhaps categorically Yoshev is excluded from Eidos, Asya mi Yoshev o michada mehanach. You can learn out Zar from Yoshev and one of the other cases. Gemara says michada mehanach. Yoshev the kasher babama minalan. How do we know, by the way, that a Yoshev is kasher by bama? Right? That if let's say again, whoever's offering on the bama, if you do it sitting, ultimately the avodah is still going to be kasher. To which the Gemara says, Amakra la'amo lifnei Hashem l'shar so lifnei Hashem v'lo lifnei bama. The pasuk says to stand before Hashem and to serve Him, which is talking about the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan. So what do you see from here? You only require amida when it's lifnei Hashem. When it's lifnei Hashem, but ultimately again, if it's not lifnei Hashem, i.e. on a bama, ultimately again you don't need amida. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, so it turns out that essentially what the Gemara does over here is, here's the good news. Everyone is agreeing that a zar is not permitted to go ahead and do the avoda. And if he does so, ultimately the avoda is invalidated. Where do I know that from? First approach, a pasuk, v'nazru mikadshe b'nei Yisrael v'lo yechalalu. Put the v'nazru mikadshe, kohanim who are tameim have to stay away from karbanos. B'nei Yisrael v'lo yechalalu. And if a ben Yisrael, i.e. a zar, does it, he makes it chulin, he invalidates the avoda. Second approach, Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, ultimately, again, it's learning it out from a kal v'chomer. Which exact kal v'chomer? That's a machlokes, but the kal v'chomer creates a principle. What's the principle? Anytime someone is precluded from doing the avoda is invalidated. So to a zar who is prohibited to do the avoda, if he does so, the avoda is invalidated. So that's it. Everyone agrees on the conclusion. One of two sources for that conclusion. Next, onein. An onein. So we'll say, remember again, who's the onein? So the onein ultimately, again, is the individual. Now remember, aninos, for our purposes, means specifically the state of mourning between death and burial. Now, again, we'll go with that approach over here, although in general, sometimes in halacha or in Gemara, onein could also just mean general avelos. But for our purposes, let's just keep it the more specific definition of the period between death and burial. So again, a kohen is not permitted to go ahead and serve as an onein. If he's an onein, he can't do the avoda. Now, there's one exception to that rule, which is kohen gadol. Kohen gadol is makriv onein. Kohen gadol does the avoda even in a state of aninos. The Gemara says as follows: Minalan. So from where do I know? So really, again, I will say what the Gemara is asking when it says minalan is, minalan means, how do I know that if a kohen who's an onein does the avoda is invalid? Where do I know that from? So Gemara says, "Dechsev umina mikdash lo yetze v'lo yechalel." The pasuk when it talks about the kohen gadol says that the kohen gadol should not leave the mikdash and should not profane. Now, the way the Gemara is understanding it is the kohen gadol should not leave the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore what? What is he doing? He's going to do the avoda. And when he does the avoda, he doesn't profane the avoda because his sacred even in a state of aninus. But what can you infer from that? Ha'acher shelo yatza, but another kohen who in a state of aninus didn't leave, but instead remained in the mikdash, ultimately what? Chilal, does profane the avoda. So the Gemara is learning out the fact that the kohen gadol has an obligation to be makriv onein, to do the avoda even when he's an onein, and if he does so, if he doesn't do so, if he leaves, he profanes. That tells me that other kohanim aren't allowed to do the avoda when in a state of aninos, and if they do so, they do profane the avoda. So we'll say that's our first approach. Rabbi Elazar brings a different source. Hein hikrivu ani krafti. So we'll say, others say, the source is in Parshas Achremos, after the death of Nadav and Avihu. So again, I will say, so there's a whole discussion over here because one of the Aaron said to fully burn one of the karbanos, and Aaron says to Moshe, "Hey Nikrivu, did my sons offer up the karban? Ani hikrafti, I offered it up." Aaron says. So also what you see from here is, Moshe Rabbeinu was upset that the karban was burnt. Aaron said, "I made the decision to burn it." Again, we'll get into this more in just a moment. And Aaron said, I'm the one who offered it. Now, interestingly enough, it's only because Aaron offered it that Moshe Rabbeinu was surprised that it was burnt. What can you see from here? Had one of Aaron's sons, a regular kohen, offered it, then Moshe would have agreed that the karban should have been burned. Why? Because it would have been invalid. Why would it have been invalid? Because the sons were owning him. And regular kohanim who are in a state of aninos cannot do the avoda. Incredible. Rabbi Elazar, my time amar mi umin mikdash lo yetze. Why does Rabbi Elazar use this last pasuk? Why doesn't he learn it out from mina mikdash lo yetze? Amar lecha miksiv ha'achar shelo yatza chilal. Does the pasuk say that if someone other than the kohen gadol did it, he profaned the avoda? The pasuk doesn't say that. It doesn't say it. You're inferring it, but the pasuk itself doesn't say it. The other opinion, my time lo amar mehenekrivu, and why doesn't the other opinion learn it out from henekrivu? Kasavar mipnei tuma nisrafa. This is very interesting. He holds that by Parshas Achremos, the reason why the karban was burned in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu had nothing to do with aninos. The reason it was burned was because it was tameh. somehow it had become tamei. That's why it was burned. So now once again, so we'll say you see a common theme over here. The Rabbi Shmuel is constantly trying to learn out these halachas from a kavachomer. Because the psukim, now the one thing we have to acknowledge is the psukim are not explicit in this context. Because they're not explicit, the Rabbi Shmuel kind of just lapses back to a kavachomer. So therefore, what's the kavachomer? What's the kavachomer that says that an onein, if he does the avoda, ultimately the avoda is profane, so this is invalid. So Gemara says, brings kavachomer balmum. What's the kavachomer? We'll say uma amud beis uma balmum shochel im avad chilal. Then we'll say once again a balmum. A balmum is allowed to go ahead and eat karbanos from kachei kadoshim, but yet that same balmum, if he does the avoda, he invalidates it. Again, a balmum is considered to be on a higher level because he at least has license to eat. So he's allowed to eat, but yet if he does the avoda is profane. Onein shein ochel, or onein who is not permitted to eat from kachei kadoshim, eino din shim avad chilal. Then it goes without saying that what? That if he did the avoda, he certainly profanes it. That's their kavachomer. Gemara says, 1 second. This is a repeat of the previous conversation. You bring right from Balmum. Balmum is a different category. Why? Because Balmum is the only invalidation where the invalidation applies to both what? Offering and offerer. Offerer. Right? Yeah. Right? In other words, it applies both to the coin as well as to the carbon. In other words, if the coin is blemished, he can't do the avoda. And if the carbon is blemished, he can't bring it as an offering. So the Gemara says, Zar yochiach. So I'll bring a riot from Zar, right? Because I remember again, Zar, the Gemara says, is not allowed to eat, and ultimately, again, if he does the avodah, it's invalid. Say the same thing by an onein, to which the Gemara says, Malazar shekin ein lo takana. Here's the difference. You can't bring a riot from Zar, but why I both say, being a Zar is a non-rectifiable status. In other words, once a Zar, always a Zar. Once a Zar, always a Zar. That's different, by the way, than, let's say, onein, right? Onein ultimately, again, is an episodic status. It is going to change. Balmum yochen. So go back to Balmum. Problem is Balmum that can't serve as a raya. Why? Because Balmum is unique, that it applies both to the offering and the offerer. So in reality, these cases are exactly comparable. But what's the common denominator? What's the common denominator? Shein musharin. All of these people are not allowed to do the avoda, right? That's what's the common denominator. V'im avdu, and if they did do the avoda, chilalu. The avoda is compromised and invalid. Therefore, I will say that's the principle. The right common denominator amongst all of these individuals is they're not allowed to do the avoda, and if they did so, the avoda is invalid. Af ani avi onein. So too, I will go ahead and I will bring an onein. I'll include onein. Shemusar. Right? An onein is not allowed to do the avoda, and if he does so, ve'im avad chilal, and if he did do the avoda, ultimately again the avoda is going to be compromised. Okay, now we'll say. Now the Gemara asks, that sounds good. Heichan mushar. From where do I know that an onein is not allowed to do the avoda? So we'll say, here's what I want to point out. Our Mishnah says that if the onein did the avoda ultimately again is invalid. What I'm saying is, just in general, from where do I know that an onein is not allowed to do the avoda? Where does that information come from? So the Gemara says, Hekan musar ilema mi v'mina mikdash lo yetzei chila b'gufei ksibe. So if you want to learn out from the pasuk that we mentioned before, mi mina mikdash lo yetzei, which again is referring to the Kohen Gadol. And saying the Kohen Gadol does not leave the Mikdash even in a state of aninos, and therefore you're going to infer from there it's a Kohen Gadol who doesn't leave, a Kohen Gadol who's makrivonein, but a regular Kohen is not makrivonein. Okay, if that's what you're going to learn out from, here's the issue. B'gufei ksibbe. Then I say, I don't need this whole kavachomer, because then I could just learn out from the pasuk itself that the avodah is invalidated. I don't need the whole kavachomer. Ella mehein hekrivu kasavar. And rather, you're going to learn out from the pasuk, ultimately from the exchange between Aaron and Moshe in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu, where Aaron says to Moshe, "You think it's Elazar and Itamar who offered it? My sons, no, I offered it. What do you see from here? You see from here that Aaron was saying, I'm allowed to offer it, and ultimately, again, I decided to burn it. The kasavar Mipnei aninos nisrafa. And what happened, Rabbi say? What happened? Why did Aaron burn the carbon? If he's the Kohen Gadol and he's allowed to offer it in a state of aninos, then ultimately, again, why did he burn it afterwards? To which the answer to that is Aaron felt he had, as a Kohen, license to offer the carbon, but he felt in a state of aninos, he should not consume the carbon. So he offered it, and then after offering it, fully burnt it on the Mizbeach. But the reason he did that was because of aninos. So we'll say the Gemara says, Ikal mifrach. So ultimately, again, but here's the problem, you could ask on the Kavachomer, Ma la tarashav shebohen shekein lo chutra michlalo. Sfira both saying, in a lot of these cases, ultimately, again, there is no permitted paradigm, or there's no permitted case in these categories. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is right across. Lo hutra michlalo, zar ubalmum, michlal isuran shenesru b'mikdash, lo hutru eitzel shum karban, v'lo eitzel shum adam. Tomer ba'onin shuta michlalo eitzel kohen gadol. So interestingly enough, in a case of zar, in a case of balmum, there's no exceptions to that rule, right? It's asr in all cases. Onain, interestingly enough, there is an exception to the rule of onain. Who's the exception to the rule of onain? Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol. So perhaps again you can't make this kal v'chomer. Tamei yochiach. No, but the Gemara says, what about Tamei? Right? Tamei will prove ultimately again because halacha l'maisa. Tamei also has an exception. As we're going to see, what's the exception of Tamei? Tamei is permitted in the case of what we'll call carbon sibor. Rabbi said that, right, halacha l'maisa, we'll talk about this, that if, we saw this really a little bit in Harias also, that halacha l'maisa, if you have the majority of the tzibor in a state of tumah, that allows for the offering of certain communal karbanos. So there is a permitted case of tamei, yet the halacha is that someone whose tamei is not permitted to do a karban, and if he does so, it's invalid. So the tamei, shekein metamei. Can't bring a raya from tamei. Why? Because it was unique in what sense? Someone whose tamei has the ability to communicate that status to someone else. To which the Gemara says, Hanach yochichu. Okay, so they both say the Gemara keeps going in circles a little bit, that none of these cases are fully comparable to one another. But what is the tzara shava shelahen shemusharim? But we keep coming back to the common denominator, and the common denominator holds constant. What is the common denominator? That any case where halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to do the avoda. If you did the avoda, what happens? It's invalid. So too, I will include onain, where halacha l'maisa, again, we've established the onain is not allowed to do the avoda. By extension, this common denominator says that halacha l'maisa, if he did so, ultimately again it's aser. I v'lifroch ma'alatar sheva sheba shekein lo hutru michlalan eitzel kohen gadol the carbon yachid. So the Gemara says maybe the common denominator is in all of these cases, right? There is no permitted case ultimately again by a kohen gadol carbon yachid, by an individual carbon. The Gemara says shem tuma mia ishtari. But again, tumah is different, right? Because tumah is permitted where? In a case of carbon sibur. So Mesharshi therefore switches gears a little bit. Mesharshi says like this. Let's learn it out. From Yoshev. Remember what's the case of Yoshev? Kohen who is sitting and does the avoda. What's halacha by Yoshev? Ma Yoshev she'ochel. Now again, a Kohen who's sitting is permitted to eat kachei kadoshim. And yet, what's the halacha? Im avad chilal. If he does the avoda while sitting, ultimately the sitting is the avoda is chulin, is profane, is invalid. Therefore, onain she'ino ochel eno dimshim avad chilal. An onain who is not permitted to eat, not permitted to eat kachei kadoshim. Certainly, if he does the avoda is going to be invalid. That's the kavachomer. Kavachomer from Yoshev. Just 1 second. Umali Yoshev shekein pasla ida. So we'll say this is the same conversation we had before. But 1 second. You can't bring a raya from Yoshev. Why? Because Yoshev as a category ultimately again is excluded from other things. For example, testimony. Va'amdu shnei ha'anashim, 2 people will stand. So you can't have someone who is sitting, going out and giving testimony. Which Gemara says, Miyushav Talmid Chacham. No, it's not true. There's a case of a Talmid Chacham who can give testimony even while sitting. No, but here's the difference. Yoshev as a category is excluded from Eidos. You're right, you have an exception as a Talmid Chacham, but categorically it is excluded. To which the Gemara says, "Ma'al Shem Yoshev, she gave us like this. Shem Yoshev lo parach." Okay, so the Tana is not talking about categorical things, talking about specific cases. Then Tim Salome parach. And if you want to say that he does bring up a raya ultimately again from Yoshev, or does ask based on the categorical exclusion, ask him Yoshev or Michad Mehanach. You can go ahead and learn out the case of Zar from Yoshev and one of the other cases. Okay, so we'll say, so bottom line, once again, good news. What's the good news? Everyone agrees. What does everyone agree on? That a Zar is not allowed to do the avoda, and if he does so, the avoda is invalid. Where do we know this from? One of three possibilities. Possibility one is the Torah's general discussion about aninos by a Kohen, right? By a Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol does it even while the Onein, it tells me that a regular Kohen cannot. Possibility two, the pasuk where it has the exchange between Moshe and Aaron saying, I offer this as the Kohen Gadol, and therefore it is permitted, which tells me that a regular Kohen can't go ahead and serve in a state of aninos. Or possibility number three, the Rabbi Shmuel, a kavachomer which creates a mamatzinu, which creates essentially a paradigm, and the paradigm says anytime you're not allowed to go ahead and do the avoda, if you did so, it is profane. So to an onein who's not allowed to do the avoda, if he does so, it's profane. So again, everyone is agreeing on the outcome. Three different possibilities as to what the source is. Incredible. Next, onein pasal. So Gemara says, "Onei pasal Amarava lo shana elu b'karban yachid." So I'll say, now we're still on the same topic of aninos. The Gemara just drills down on this a little bit more. The Gemara says Rava, I only know that this is true in a case of a karban yachid, right? In a case of an individual karban. Aval karban sibor miratza. Rabbi say an onein who does. So when do we say that an onein ultimately again is asar? That's only in the case of a karban yachid. But in the case of karban sibor, communal offering, ultimately again the is permitted. Where do I know this from? Kavachomer mituma. It's kavachomer from tuma. What's the kavachomer? Ma tuma shelo hutra michlala eitzel kohen gadol. Right, the karban yachid. Hutra eitzel head. So by tuma, let's just read this and then we're going to stop over here for today. So when it comes to tuma, which ultimately again is not permitted by a kohen gadol, by a karban yachid, which means there is no license for a kohen gadol to do any avoda in a state of tumah whenever it comes to individual sacrifices. Yet, hutra eitzel hedyot bekarban sibor. Yet Rabbi say when it comes to a karban sibor communal offerings, tumah hutra b'tzibor, which means when 51% of Klal Yisrael is tameh, ultimately the laws of tumah are suspended, even for a regular individual, right? Even not just for a kohen, but even just for a hedyot. Therefore, aninos shehutra michlala eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid, aninos, which is permitted for a kohen gadol, even by personal sacrifices, enodin shehutra eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor. Certainly, ultimately, again, should be permitted by a kohen hedyot by karban sibor. So here I will say, so if ultimately, again, if the laws of aninos allow or are suspended by a kohen gadol, even for a private karban, then alachas kama v'kama, the laws of aninos are ultimately suspended for a kohen hedyot by a karban sibor. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Yirtzeh Hashem with this, the rest of this kavachomer tomorrow. Flesh this out a little bit more. Shkoyach. I'm sorry. Shalom. Jerry, you normally have the best background. Today, got your beat. Sorry, Shalom Mamish. Shalom. I'm assuming it's not a screensaver, right? That's the real thing. It's the real thing. All right, Baruch Hashem, should be Zochah to there Bekarov. And yes, Hashem. But not just with the wall, the whole thing. All right, we'll have a great day. He's going there now.